When Brian Eno first materialised as the feathered mascara-wearing keyboard player with Roxy Music, he looked an unlikely sonic visionary. Eno left Roxy Music in 1973 and went on to invent a whole new genre of electronic instrumental music that he called ambient music. As a producer, Eno worked with David Bowie, Devo, and Talking Heads, as well as David Byrne on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, an album that first introduced many listeners to the idea of sampling. And that's even before we get to the 1980s and Eno's groundbreaking production work with some of the biggest bands in the world today. There's also Eno the artist. As an early adopter of portable video equipment, Eno created video art in the late 1970s and installations since the 80s. His latest guise is as a curator. Eno was in Sydney in June to curate the Luminous Festival of Music and Ideas. He also performed and exhibited his video art, projecting it onto the sails of the Sydney Opera House. Tonight on Artscape, the multi-talented Brian Eno. Brian Eno, thanks for joining me. How do you organise something like Luminous? Where do you actually start?
It started actually with a very simple request, which was to build the big installation that I have downstairs. And then things started to get added to that. I think the principle was that I wanted to put together photography, ceramics, performance, painting, sculpture, music, sound art, whatever. And the job of the curator is to try to say, I think this story is interesting, to weave one pattern through all of that. People who've had a very big influence on me, whose music doesn't seem to have any connection at all necessarily. For example, the African Seun Kuti, who's the son of Fela Kuti. Fela was probably my biggest influence throughout my musical life, though it isn't, I don't think it's clear in my music where that influence, that it doesn't show as music, it shows really more as an approach to music, I think.
It's interesting too that I guess when I first heard the idea that you were doing this festival, that it occurred to me that it would all be music, but there are lectures and talks and things like that. I mean, what are their purpose? What are they there for?
Well, I think the other thing I want to show is, apart from using my own show here to try to indicate that there's a new area between music and visual art, where the two seamlessly cross and quite happily marry together. So that was one boundary I wanted to finally get rid of. Another boundary I wanted to question was the one between artistic work and intellectual work, if you like. So the idea that they shouldn't cross. I think there's a terrible prejudice in the arts against articulacy, actually. There's a sort of suspicion of if people can talk well or think about their work, they couldn't be proper artists, because artists are supposed to be sort of passionate, inarticulate people who dredge things from the sort of primitive center of their being. and, you know, well, I think that is part of being an artist. I don't think that's the whole story by any means. I remember one of the most upsetting things that I ever saw is in England, Ron Kittai, who's an amazing painter, had an exhibition where he decided to write the cards beside the painting. So instead of a curator or a critic writing a kind of description of what the painting was about, Kittai decided to do it himself. He was absolutely murdered by British critics for doing that. The cruelest criticism I've ever seen, because to them it seemed to represent an artist who was too big for his own boots. You know, what a nerve. You think you've got a brain as well?
Isn't it about a kind of articulation then? I mean, I would have thought the contemporary art world is over-articulate in a sense.
Well, it's over-inarticulate. I mean, the worst writing in the world comes out of contemporary art world, without any doubt, there's nothing worse in terms of sheer incoherence, actually. First of all, the inability to express a thought clearly, and secondly, the lack of any thoughts. So you have no thoughts inarticulately expressed. It really is the worst writing you can get. So that's the kind of articulacy I don't trust. But there are a lot of artists who do think about what they do and who try to find how it fits in terms of the frame of the whole culture including science and philosophy and politics and so on. And they're consistently not rewarded for the effort. You know, they're certainly in England, they're consistently told that they shouldn't really bother their pretty little heads with that kind of thing. So I do bother my not so pretty head with it, and I shall continue to do so.
Is curating an art form? Is it a creative act?
Good curators really are a new form of storyteller, in that what they're doing is saying, here's a group of cultural objects. I claim that they're related in some way. That's what curation is. It's claiming a relationship between things. So, you know, the history of art is full of stories of art developing linearly, like, you know, Braque led to Picasso, and Picasso led to this person and that person, as if there was a sort of cause and effect chain like that. But actually, the interesting thing about modern art is that clearly isn't the case. There's a whole field of things going on, and that field includes photography, ceramics, performance, painting, sculpture, music, sound art, whatever. And the job of the curator is to try to say, I think this story is interesting, to weave one pattern through all of that field, and another curator weaves that pattern. So curators do an interesting job in that they tell us new stories about our culture.
Oh, I read that you found some of the Australian bands through YouTube. Sign, for instance. Do you think YouTube is any kind of useful tool for that act of curation?
Well, if you live on the other side of the world, it's the only tool you have. So it was very useful indeed to be able to hear about something and then see something straight away. It's like speed dating a bit, you know. The good thing about speed dating is you know pretty well if you don't like something. You can tell that very quickly. So it cancels out a lot of things immediately. It's a good filter.
Do you think it's a useful tool in that way of being able to self-select what you like and what you don't like? Is that where television is headed, do you think?
Television has no future, basically. You know, it's finished as a medium, really. That's why YouTube and people's own personal approaches to making programs are so interesting. Television murdered itself, really. And once it recovers from its suicide, there might be a renaissance of some kind, but it doesn't do anything interesting. When I see all this glitz and these same formulas about how people look on television, what the lighting is like, how the sound is done, it's just a whole received tradition based on absolutely nothing except convention. That's how we've done it before, you know. And I just think it's finished. It has no energy as a form anymore. Sorry about that. I realise that's what you're all doing. But you've got to rethink your world.
I was wondering if you could explain scenius, the word you've invented. What does it mean?
Well, when I was at art school, like everybody else who's at art school, I was told that, you know, the story of art is the story of a few great geniuses having wonderful ideas that then everybody else catches up with. But about 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, I went to a show at the Barbican of early 20th century Russian painting, which is an area of painting that I'm particularly keen on. And what I realized when I saw this show, which was a very big show, was there wasn't just Kandinsky and Rodchenko and Tatlin and Klein and the few names that I knew. There were thousands and thousands of artists at work. And not only artists, there were curators, there were white Russian princes, there were dealers, and they were all doing something in this scene. So I realized that actually that was an ecology. There was a kind of an ecology there where every part had its contribution and was part of the network of transactions going on. So I thought some scenes are better than others, like that particular one in St. Petersburg in 1906 to 1913, for example, was so fruitful and so alive. So I came up with this word scenius, which is the communal version of genius. And I think scenius is actually what I'm interested in. I'm interested in situations which produce good outcomes rather than in individuals that produce good outcomes.
So to articulate it in those terms, is that an attempt to create a scene?
Yes, I think so. And I think you can create scenes. Unfortunately, we normally only do it consciously in wartime. For example, the Manhattan Project, development of the atomic bomb, was a quite deliberately created scene. It involved 120,000 people, huge sums of money, and a very specific directive. We must develop an atomic weapon. So, of course, the fallout from that, to use a poor metaphor, was a lot of other science that came out of it as well. But the fact is, it is possible to hothouse humans, to put them together and say, let's do something, and you can make something happen. Disney was another example of a scenius, I think. So I think, we ought to be thinking more consciously in terms of how those fruitful communal creative scenes work, because we desperately need to make one right now to address this big challenge of climate change. We really need to be able to harness the intelligence and creativity of everybody, actually, of anybody who can offer it.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because the examples that you cited were ones that were developed for a specific goal, for something at the end, whereas perhaps the Russians who were working in St. Petersburg didn't necessarily know what was coming out the other end.
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right, and you've put your finger on the biggest difference between science and defense type sceniuses and cultural ones. And the biggest difference, I think, is that the science and defense ones are nearly always directed towards a particular goal. The cultural ones are nearly always directed away from something. So the revolutionary period in Russia was very much, we're not going to do that, we don't want that, that is finished. So there's a big difference between those. One is pushing towards something, one is pushing away from something. And I think in culture, more frequently, you're in the pushing away. I mean, if you think of at the same time as that, the Cubists, and in the early 20th century, the Vorticists, the Futurists, and so on, what they claimed to be doing was embracing the future. But of course, it's very hard to articulate a future. What you can do, though, is to say, we know it isn't that. You can point to the things that it isn't. And culturally, I think that's more normally how things move forward, or what creates movements is a reaction against something rather than a very specific goal towards something.
If we could just step back in time for a moment, could you tell us the story of how you came to invent ambient music?
Yes, I had been a record collector. I had lots of records. And I had been noticing more and more that I was annoyed by the fact that records changed mood every 3 or 4 minutes. So there'd be the fast track, then the slow track, then the ballad, then the sad track, then another dance track. And it just started getting on my nerves. I didn't want to have my mood changed so quickly. So I started, this was a time of cassettes, and I started making cassette tapes of things in the same mood, basically. And I had a painter friend who was doing the same thing, and he put together a beautiful cassette which was all the slow movements from the late Haydn quartets, 6 of them. That was a joy to listen to. None of that frantic allegro stuff, just all the slow parts. And I started to think, why don't any records like this exist? Why isn't there something that just offers you the chance to stay in a mood? And it says, here it is. It's all the same. Nothing much is going to change. Take it or leave it. And so this feeling was consolidated that one day I was sitting in this beautiful airport, Cologne Airport. It was a Sunday morning and the sun was streaming in. It was the most beautiful piece of architecture, very high space with glass all on one side, and the most idiotically stupid pop music playing. I thought, nobody has thought about this problem. You put all this attention into the architecture and the ambience in every respect except the music. And what is the music? It's what some person has brought in that morning and stuck in a cassette player. No thought to that at all. So I thought, this is an unsolved problem, really. So then I started to think, so if you're in an airport, what kind of music do you want? What's it got to be able to do? It's got to be interrupted frequently because, you know, you have people announcing planes and calling passengers and so on. So it can't be narrative. It can't be important that you hear the whole of the narrative. It's got to be a feeling rather than a story. So I started in my mind constructing what would be the right music for that airport. And by the time my plane arrived, I realized I'd thought of a record that I wanted to make, which became Music for Airports. And then that led on to the general idea of ambient music.
Did the processes that you were using to make that earlier ambient music sort of lead on to the generative music that you were doing in the 90s?
Yes. So that was another important aspect of the idea of ambient music, was that I wanted music that lasted forever, if you wanted it to. Mm-hmm. I didn't want it to go away. So if you wanted to listen to it all day, you could. And so I started then to think of machines, basically, essentially systems that would generate music. And that was what became what I call generative music, where you have a limited stock of material which is being recombined and shuffled together and merged in different ways so that it keeps producing this combination of familiar and new, which I like. I like when those two things are together. For example, like watching a river where it's always the same river, but it's never the same experience, you know. So I wanted to do something like that in music.
Your installation work, 77 million paintings, is in Luminous, and it's one of a number of works you've done over the years using generative processes. Could you explain what you mean by generative in this context?
Yes. So I suppose what I mean by it is that the responsibility of the artist becomes inventing a system that produces his work rather than just producing the work. So, for example, I could do one painting. I have done in the past. Or I could invent a system of producing lots and lots and lots of paintings, which is sort of what I've done here in this work. So all of the original material in that I made by hand or photographically or with the computer. And the machine, which is the software that runs this, essentially is recombining those things, shuffling them together, so it's producing a huge variation. You know, in one day that thing will produce more separate pictures than an artist could produce in a lifetime. So that artist might say, yeah, but they're not as good as mine, which may be a good argument. There's a home version which you can run on your computer. In fact, this really started with the home version. I was walking home from my studio one evening and in London's fashionable Notting Hill, and I looked in a window and there was a dinner party going on, 12 people at a table, and on the wall was a huge plasma screen, that big, and black, of course, because there's nothing you can show You're not going to have the news showing or television. And I thought, that should be a painting there. So that was the first intention, was to make something that would occupy that new cultural space. Just like music for airports, this was occupying a new cultural space. And so here's a space. Why aren't we artists making use of it? So the first intention was to make something that would become a slowly changing painting in your room, so you wouldn't have to watch television any longer, which of course is the aim of most of my work, to persuade people that there's something else they can do with their screens.
So is it the technology that gives you the idea? Is that the impetus?
A lot of ideas come out of technology. Pop music is one of them. It came out of two technologies, the record and the recording studio. Well, three, and the radio station. Those three technologies. When those three things came together, it was absolutely obvious that people would make 3-minute singles and that they would have million-selling hits and so on and so on. So art and technology are always completely bound up like that. A set of possibilities comes into being, and artists jump onto them and take advantage of them.
You said once that a lot of technology offers you the chance to make everything completely wonderful and perfect, and thus take out whatever residue of human life was in the work to start with. How are you investing your own work with a human identity?
Well, this is actually a very serious question, because it's always a problem with technologies. At the moment, recording studios are dominated by a technology called Pro Tools, which is very powerful, very interesting, new way of recording, and absolutely lethal in the wrong hands. It really does offer you the chance to take out every single error, to correct every single thing that would identify this with any human being's life or performance. So you have to be very clear about where you want the work to be.
It seems to me, though, that a lot of your work has come out of a deliberate process of limiting your options for what you can do.
Yes, well, I think you have to do that. When I first started working in studios, you could walk in and say, well, let's just try everything out and see what happens. And that would take you about half a day. If you did that now, you walked into a studio and say, let's try everything out and see what happens, you'd be there in about 400 years' time, because the number of possibilities is so vast now. Mm-hmm. So one way of working is just to say, I'm not going to try everything out. In fact, I'm not going to try that. I'm going to try that and see what I can find in that. And so one of the things I think I do as a producer a lot of the time is to cancel options, just to say, don't let's go there, don't let's go there. In fact, don't let's go anywhere that we're already familiar with, and let's see what's left.
You've had a number of well-known and highly successful creative collaborations over the years. David Byrne, U2 and Coldplay, to name just a few. Does collaboration still play a part in your creative process now?
I like collaborations because a number of things happen when you're collaborating that don't happen easily on your own. One of them is that you see your ideas through somebody else's eyes. So you're trying something and somebody else is there, and of course you're now not hearing it the way you normally hear it. You're hearing it through what you imagine is their mind, and that's very, very interesting. Sometimes it sounds much worse, sometimes it sounds much better. It's very interesting that sometimes your own ideas feel better filtered through somebody else's mind, sort of thing. So it sometimes gives you a confidence in your work that you might not have otherwise. The other thing that happens when you're working with somebody is that you have to actually contribute. So it kicks you to keeping coming up with something, you know, throwing, even if you're not sure that you've got anything to offer, you try it anyway, and oh, well, it was something. It flowers into something. And of course, other people surprise you. That's what's nice about them.
Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
Brian Eno, thank you very much.
Thank you.